James Cameron Newton Jr. was born on April 6, 1831 in DuBose County, Indiana. Like his father, James was a farmer. The early Newtons came across from England and settled in Westmoreland County, Virginia, along the Potomac River prior to 1686, where William Newton was born. William's grandson, Peter Newton, moved to Mercer County, Kentucky as part of the Revolutionary Militia, preventing the British from crossing the Ohio River. The fort on Corn Island would become Louisville later on. After the war, Peter settled in Bullitt County, Kentucky. His farm is believed to be buried inside of Fort Knox today. In fact, Peter's son and grandsons, James Newton, Isaac Newton, and John Newton's names are burned in the ceiling of Mammoth Cave. James Cameron Newton was born September 25, 1795 in Mercer County, Kentucky, and lived there until shortly after the War of 1812, where 2 million acres in Indiana were sold to the U.S. and the migration was underway. Levi Stevens was also migrating from North Carolina around the same time. James settled in DuBose County, Indiana, just west of Louisville. An excerpt from the History of DuBose County from its primitive days to 1910 by George Wilson contains this excerpt. The first purchase of land made in Jefferson Township bears the date August 5, 1834, when James Newton bought the southwest quarter of the northwest quarter of Section 1 on Anderson Creek. So by the time that James Cameron Jr. was born in 1831, the family had been in DuBose County for 14 years. James was the 9th of 11 children born to the family. James married Mary Alvey on September 13, 1860. Mary was from Perry County, just south of DuBose. The 1860 census shows that James was living in DuBose County with Mary and his mother, 72 years old and widowed. James would serve in the Civil War as a private in the Indiana 23rd Infantry Regiment. The regiment was called up in the latter part of 1861 and fought in the Western Theater with General Grant, fighting in Vicksburg, and then with General Sherman through Atlanta to Savannah. It is very likely that James Newton and John G. Williams were in the same battles as the war came to an end. His mother, Margaret, who was called Peggy, died in 1862 while James was away. When James returned from the war, the family moved to Perry County, just south of DuBose. James' wife, Mary, lived in Perry before they were married. Her parents owned a large farm, and the Newtons moved next to them. They lived there after James died on October 24, 1875, just months after his last son was born. James Marcus Newton was born on March 8, 1875 in Perry County, Indiana. James Marcus was the 5th and last child born to the Newtons. James grew up on his family farm near the Ohio River. James was not a farmer. He would always want to be a preacher. From the very beginning, the Newtons were Methodists, so it was not much of a decision what denominations James would pursue. He attended Union College in Barberville, Kentucky, graduating in 1898. The 1900 census shows him boarding at the home of Jason Barnes in Covington, Kentucky. The census lists him as a Methodist preacher, but this was before he attended Boston University for his doctorate of divinity, graduating in 1903. After graduation, James immediately returned to Covington, Kentucky, where he married Carrie Mae Warcup on November 3, 1903. The Warcups were farmers from Perry County, so it is likely they knew each other growing up. James continued his ministry in Covington, and the couple had 2 children there, Marydale and James Jr. With opportunities available in Kansas, the family moved to Frankfort in 1907. Carrie May was born there on February 28, 1908. James Jr. died there just over a year later on July 23, 1909. He was just 3 years old. At some point in his life, James had a serious accident which fractured his skull. After this, he suffered from severe headaches and had a terrible temper. Home life would be difficult for Carrie May as the youngest daughter. The family soon moved to Ottawa, Kansas, where James became the pastor of the First Methodist Church. According to his obituary, James' health failed and he went to a facility in Delphos. After recovering, the family moved around, but settled again in Ottawa, where they remained for several years. Carrie May grew up in a strict and oppressive environment. According to family, as a teenager, she went out dancing, and her father shaved her head as punishment. Carrie's older sister, Mary Dale, moved back to Covington, Kentucky, marrying Allie Lee Jackson on August 4, 1926. Carrie May was the only daughter left in the family, and James' health and temper were getting worse. By 1928, Carrie May married Samuel Wells when she was 20 years old. By 1930, the Newtons had moved back to Covington due to James' failing health. But by 1932, James and Mary had moved back to Kansas, where Mary continued her career as a nurse. After moving into a nursing home in Salina, Kansas, in late 1933, James died on April 13, 1934, and was buried in Salina, Kansas. He was just 59 years old. The 1930 census lists Carrie and Samuel living with Roy and Minnie Kennedy, Samuel's aunt and uncle. The couple lived in Simpson, Kansas, which was about 200 miles west of Ottawa. Simpson was a tiny town literally in the middle of nowhere. Samuel's mother died from complications just 7 days after he was born. His widowed father had 10 other children to raise alone and could not care for a baby. Samuel's aunt and uncle took him in and raised him from the beginning as if he was their own son. Samuel would live with his aunt until he died on August 13, 1967. He lived just 31 years after Dorothy was born. His aunt would live 2 years after him and die at 92 years old. Carrie and Sam continued to live with Sam's relatives, and things were not going well in western Kansas. The Depression had racked the entire country, but the real devastation was just beginning in Mitchell County. Dust storms made farming very difficult in western Kansas. There was no way of knowing how severe the conditions were in Simpson. Samuel was determined to farm with his family, and Carrie had other plans. Samuel would farm in Mitchell County his whole life, dying on his farm August 13, 1967. He was 61 years old. Carrie May left the farm and the isolation when she left Samuel, and she had a secret. Carrie May was pregnant. Sometime in late 1935, Carrie May moved to Covington, Kentucky. Her father had died a year earlier, ending any fears she might have had about a confrontation. But she did not go to her mother, who was in Topeka nursing. She went to her sister for help. On March 5, 1936, the German Zeppelin Hindenburg left its Friedrichshafen base to begin its maiden voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to New York. No one knew then, but 14 months later, it would burst into flames as one of the worst disasters in history. That same day, Dorothy Dawn was born in a nondescript Catholic hospital in Covington, Kentucky. L. Frank Baum had written the widely popular book, The Wizard of Oz in 1900, and by 1920 he had written 14 books in the series. As a result, Dorothy, the book's main heroine, was a very popular name. In 1936, it was the sixth most used name among newborn girls. Dorothy Dawn would be called Dot most of her life. After Dorothy was born, Carrie had to decide what to do next. Single mothers were ostracized in 1936. Questions would lead to other questions, and whispers would not stop. There are many conspiracies and rumors surrounding this divorce, and for whatever reasons, Carrie May took her secrets to the grave. Dorothy would always question the identity of her father. She never met him. In fact, when the divorce was finalized in 1938, Dorothy was not mentioned. In 1938, Miami was still a relatively unknown city. Being the most remote city in the country, many people moved there to escape. Big enough to disappear in, and small enough to offer opportunity and second chances. But Miami was in the throes of the Depression, so it was not certain when Carrie moved. There are no records of her in Miami prior to 1940. And since the records in the census are dated, it is probable that she moved after her divorce in early 1938. She would have been difficult to find in Miami with no support. Samuel Wells had found a new wife and was interested in removing the past. In fact, Samuel was remarried just a month after the divorce, and his obituary does not even mention his first wife or Dorothy, his daughter. Years later, Dot would correspond with her Aunt Minnie, but that was the extent of the relationship. The first mention of Dorothy is in the 1940 census. She was 4 years old. Notice in this census, the birth states of Dorothy's father and mother are switched. Samuel was born in Iowa and Carrie in Kansas. This could be the taker's mistake, which happens more often than not. Carrie ran a laundry facility called Classy Cleaners. They lived above the business on Northwest 36th Street, just a block west of Miami Avenue. Carrie's youngest brother, John, was living with her. John lived near Carrie in Kansas in 1930. Being only 17 years old, he was a boarder with Willis Hummel, who owned a car repair shop. He and Carrie were 15 miles apart, so it's not surprising that John came to Miami with her. John listed his profession as a fender man. He eventually worked at Johnny and Mac by the railroad track. According to family, John was in an accident with a train. His injuries took a great deal of time to heal and required a cast from his waist down. This could be the time he was recuperating. John would be drafted during World War II and serve in the Pacific as a Seabee. Seabees would construct airfields and buildings after islands were taken. He was discharged in January 1946 after the war. He often told a story of his scaffolding collapsing and falling and being saved by a nail sticking out that caught his chin. 1940 was a year of change for Carrie and Dot. Prior to that, Carrie had met Earl Pollard, a beverage company delivery man. By May 1940, she was married to him. It appears that Earl had recently gotten a divorce from Margaret Jeanette. That divorce was finalized just weeks before the wedding. Things were changing for Dorothy. She lived in a new city and quickly had a new stepdad. It might have been overwhelming had it not been for Lena Thompson. Lena would marry Walter Klein shortly after. The couple would continue to live on 43rd Street, just a few blocks from the Cleaners. Lena had moved to Miami from Missouri just before the 1926 hurricane. Great timing. Dorothy was baptized on April 9th, 1939 at the Torbo Memorial Methodist Church. Lena was her godmother. George, Carrie's other brother, was the godfather. Walter Klein worked as a carpenter for Protect U, a large shutter manufacturer. Lena was a piano teacher, and from everything I could discern, a very good piano teacher. Dot began lessons prior to her baptism in 1939. And when Earl and Carrie moved together after the marriage, they lived just 2 blocks from Lena on Northwest First Avenue. Earl had come to Miami about the same time as Carrie. He was working in Valdosta with Southern Beverage, a large Coca-Cola producer from Mississippi. Southern opened a distribution and Coke manufacturing center in Miami in 1938. Earl and Margaret transferred to the new distributor. Eventually, the Southern Beverage Company created a subsidiary called National Brands, and Earl worked there for a number of years. It is not clear how or when Carrie met Earl. It seems likely that he was distributing in the area of Classy Cleaners. Both were divorced, and that stigma was removed. Dorothy was an exceptional piano student, both gifted and a tireless worker. Lena saw great potential and pushed her to excel. In 1943, the Piano Teachers Guild began awarding students who took part in their auditions. On May 21st, the Miami News listed students of Lena Klein who have completed the auditions performing the number of pieces required. Dorothy was at the top of the list as Lena's first student. She had just turned 7 years old. Dorothy was clearly a prodigy and star pupil for Lena, who had many students by this time. In June 1945, she is included in a list of the top national pianists, and she was 9 years old. The next year, as a 10-year-old, Dorothy was again listed in the national roll of the nation's top pianist. It does not appear that there are age groups in this competition. There are no city directory records in 1943, so it is difficult to determine when the family moved from their Northwest Avenue address. It appears that they purchased their house in late 1943 or early 1944. This was the only house they would own at 3444 Northwest 17th Street. They would live there until Earl died in 1978. Dorothy grew to depend on Lena, who was pushing her to enter contests throughout her adolescent years. At some point, Lena formed the Chopin Clubs of the National Fraternity of Student Musicians. The first meeting to appear in the news was November 14, 1947. Dorothy was 11 years old and treasurer of the Junior Club. On May 11, 1947, 44 students took part in the National Guild of Piano Teachers auditions. Lena Klein was the chairman of the local chapter. These auditions were judged by an outside professional. In this case, the auditions were conducted by Grace White from New York. Dorothy is listed with the national winners, being the highest degree of testing as they were judged on 10 pieces. The next year, she is the winner of the same audition in the 3-day competition. By 1949, Dorothy is the president of the Chopin Senior Club at 13 years old. Dorothy has also again won the National Piano Teachers Guild Award, this time flawlessly completing a 15-piece program. Dorothy was also gaining notoriety in her school, Citrus Grove Junior High. In October 1949, she authored a joint article in the Miami News proposing changes in the honor roll system. On November 22, 1949, she sponsored a talent show with proceeds going to fix the school's water cooler. In 1950, she reported for the Miami News on the District Vocal Music Festival, which she would be an accompanist. On May 1950, the Chopin Club presented their third annual piano concert at the White Temple Church. Dorothy participated in the senior group. In May 1950, Dorothy was again awarded the National Guild of Piano Teachers National Certificate, playing 15 pieces. During the summer, in either 1949 or 1950, Dorothy attended a Methodist summer camp. There she surrendered her life to Jesus. She would leave the Methodist Church a few years later and be baptized at Riverside Baptist Church on August 24, 1952. Dorothy rounded out her last year representing Citrus Grove in the Miami News Youth Roundup for outstanding work in the field of journalism. Each school had a representative. Dorothy graduated from Citrus Grove Junior High on June 3, 1951. 7 days later, she qualified for another national winner in the chapter of the National Guild of Piano Teachers. This was her 8th straight year. She would win again in 1952, making it 9 straight years. Months prior to her graduation, a big change in her home life would precede many more changes. On January 29, 1951, James Earl Pollard was born to Carrie and Earl. Carrie was 1 month short of her 43rd birthday. Dorothy was almost 15 years old. The entire focus of the family changed when Jep was born, and Dorothy would be responsible for much of his care. The following year, Dorothy would attend Miami High, where her life would change forever. Dorothy was in a geometry class in 1952 when she announced that she was a descendant of Sir Isaac Newton. One of the students in the class was amused by such a brash assertion. It turns out he was also in the chorus, where Dot was playing the piano, even though they were a year apart. After a chance meeting at Grinnell's Park, Herb asked Dot to accompany him at Riverside Baptist Church, where he was scheduled to sing. They began to rehearse together and soon fell in love and were inseparable. Herb and Dot were quite a pair. In November 1952, a Miami High octet performed as part of a celebration of the Daughters of the Revolution. Mrs. Patrick Henry was present. Although not mentioned in the article, I feel certain that Herb participated. Dorothy accompanied the group. The school year of 1953 was a dream, with Dot sharing it with Herb. But Herb would graduate and leave the following fall for the University of Florida in Gainesville. A full-page entry in Herb's senior yearbook perfectly describes Dot's feelings with Herb leaving for school the next year, but she is very hopeful for the future. I wish you all the luck and happiness next year in your new school. I just wish I could share that year with you too, but we can't be selfish, and I love you too much to wish anything else. I will never forget this year with you and want to share many more in the future, even up in college. Just remember, Herb, I love you always and want more than anything else to share that love with you wherever you go. I only hope this means something to you. Let it last forever. This is my prayer. She wrote a little note at the end that was surprising to me. Please remember your calendar girl. One of her bios in the newspaper listed Calendar Girl for 1954 among her awards. Not sure about the Calendar Girl. Didn't learn about this before I started the research. Dot's senior year was lonely and anxious. She continued to play piano for the chorus and maintained her grades, again being on the National Honor Society, this year as the chaplain. She had a long list of other awards. There are no newspaper articles about the Chopin Club or the National Guild competition, and she held no class officer roles. An article in the Miami News echoes the sentiments of Herb's yearbook during her senior year. The title of the article is, "School Days Were Romantic for These Four." The article went on to quote Dorothy as she and Herb were planning a wedding as soon as she graduated. She had an engagement ring. This public announcement was problematic for Herb, as he was not ready for the news to be shared. Being at Florida, he was not able to put out the family fires that were sure to erupt. As the school year ended and the family fires were extinguished, Dot was set to graduate from Miami High. An article in the Miami Herald seemed to reflect a change in the couple's thinking, perhaps from family pressure. Dot and Herb announced their engagement in January and had plans to become Mr. and Mrs. Williams during the summer. Now the popular couple have decided to continue their education before they tie the knot. A September 1954 article in the Miami Herald lists her with 24 girls from the Miami area who have been accepted at Stetson University in DeLand. Another article a few weeks later features Dot with 3 other girls happily enrolled and attending the school. For Dot, this would not last long. Just days after publishing this article, she was on a bus headed for Gainesville. She was getting married after all. She must have felt an intense excitement none of their family knew, and there was not much time for planning. Dorothy arrived at Gainesville and was met at the station by Herb. They had made plans to elope across the Georgia state line where you could get married at 18 years old. Herb had enlisted a friend as driver and witness to help. On October 16th, the Williams were married. It appears that Dot and Herb were one of Miami's popular couples, as stated in the July postponement article. Miami was interested in their story. For just weeks after the surprise marriage, a Herald article reveals Dot and Herb returning to Miami for Thanksgiving to share time with their families. The article reports that Dot had transferred to UF after her October marriage. To clear up the Isaac Newton claim that Dorothy made in her geometry class, Isaac Newton was an actual person and in Dorothy's family line as her mother's great uncle. He was born in DuBois County, Indiana on November 23, 1833, and became a prosperous farmer by 1860 in Crawford County near the Ohio River. In June 1863, Isaac was drafted by the Union in the Civil War, but does not appear to be assigned to a military unit. Just a few months later in October, he was killed in an accident with timber in Orange County.
That place early.
There it is. That's where we used to live when I was a baby.
I know what else to do. We got some time to kill.
Well,
We got some time to kill.
yeah.
It didn't take it much more than a half an hour to get here. You know that,
Right. Well, we did good.
right? Kathy said it was going to take an hour. That kind of threw me off.
Well, she's talking about traffic, I think.
Well, we used to walk down this way. There was a professor that had something to do with mushrooms, mushroom discovery.
Yeah.
I think it was something you could eat mushrooms. What it looked through. And he's an old man.
Yeah.
No, eccentric old man. Lived right down through there. And Mom, he really took a shine to Mom. He talked to Mom all, and not me. Her. Anyway, just kind of funny.
Herb and Dot quickly settled in a small apartment near the Florida campus, where they would spend the next 3 years. Herb had renewed focus on school, and Dot was as supportive as she could be. Life in Gainesville would be exciting for the new couple. Things would quickly change in their new life together. For just 279 days after tying the marriage knot, a little present appeared. Herbert Lewis Williams Jr. was born on July 22, 1955. Dot had a much younger brother when she was growing up and had experience helping with his care. Consequently, she was well versed with baby care. The surprise marriage was not well received with Herb's family, but when Herb Jr. was born, things improved substantially. Like her mother did for her, Gladys came up to help with the baby, and Elmo, Herb's father, was a proud grandfather. During the first Christmas, Herb and Dot went to Miami and stayed with his parents. Herb Jr. was a big hit with the grandparents. Mom recounted to me how much she enjoyed life in Gainesville. Living on less than $30 a month, she always told me that it was the best decision she ever made. The family of 3 were out and about on the campus during those first years. Even Jack was on board. So here's the thing. Here's the deal. 15th Street, okay? This is, all these houses are the same now, I think. I don't see, there may be more of them. 1 block. So 1 block from the house. Now on this right here was a huge tree that we used to climb in. 36th Avenue. My best friend lived over there. And alright, so we used to have the neighbor right there. I used to go in there and visit, and next to her was Minnie 1520. There it is, right there. That's my house. A little different, little tiny house, little yard. It seemed so big when I was a kid, and that's this intersection. I witnessed 2 accidents as a little kid. Nothing really has changed. It's amazing. It's just so small, so big then. Margaret lived right over here, I thought. Dad told me no, but I thought she lived right over here. And Grandma lived right on this road. This is 17th Street, and there's the house right there. Not yet. No. In June 1957, Herb graduated from the University of Florida, and the couple made plans to move to Miami, where Herb would work in his father's accounting firm, Williams & Kaiser. Herb would recall how proud his father was after he graduated. Elmo never got the chance. Soon, they bought a small house at 1520 Northwest 36th Avenue. Dorothy was pregnant again, and Tom was on his way. On October 6, 1957, Tom Granderson Williams was born in Jackson Memorial Hospital. The headline in the Miami Herald states, "The moon visited Miami twice in 7 hours." This moon was actually the Russian satellite passing over Miami. The U.S. was behind in the space race, and the Russians caused considerable unrest with their successful launching of the first satellite. Tom would enter the world with the Cold War escalating. There was much work to be done on the couple's first house. At the beginning, the small 2-bedroom, 1-bath house was perfect for a family of 4. Dot would continuously take on projects with painting and yard work. Herb Jr. would remember her standing on a ladder in the dining room painting and telling him she was 23 years old, eating ice from a glass that she carried around with her while she worked. 1959 was a pivotal year in Miami. On January 2nd, Fidel Castro accepted the surrender of the Batista forces in Santiago and set up a provisional government. Thousands of Cuban immigrants fled to South Florida in the coming months. 2 years later, on April 17th, the CIA, in conjunction with Cuban immigrants, would conduct a disastrous attack at the Bay of Pigs. Miami would never be the same. On May 16, 1959, Castro ended the purges. By then, he had executed 621 by firing squad, although as time passed, it was determined that the numbers of the victims far exceeded those published. 2 days before that announcement, on May 14th, Castro froze the assets of 136 U.S. persons and businesses. Later that day, John Lightner Williams was born in Jackson Memorial Hospital. He would be the third boy born to the family. 18 months later, on November 9, 1960, Karen Lynn Williams was born as the last addition and the only girl. She was born on Herb's birthday, an incredible gift. The 1960 presidential election was held on November 8th, and by the morning of the 9th, newspapers were filled with the news that John F. Kennedy had won the election. Dorothy was at Jackson Memorial Hospital recovering. By Friday night, it was time for her to come home. Herb was at the Miami versus Notre Dame football game and was late for the pickup. Miami won the game, but Herb lost critical husband points. The U.S. fell even farther behind in the space race in April the next year, as Yuri Gagarin became the first human to enter space. A month later, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, but again, the U.S. was bested by the Russians. NASA had been established a few years earlier, and the U.S. was getting serious. The next year, 1962, the Cold War exploded, almost literally. In September, Kennedy gave the famous speech challenging the country to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Just weeks later, the U.S. discovered Russian missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Miami. For 35 days, the standoff pushed the countries to the brink of a nuclear war. On November 20th, the Russians backed down and tensions relaxed. By October 1962, Herb Jr. was in the second grade at Kensington Elementary. There were weekly bomb drills where students were told to crawl under their desk with their hands behind their heads. On November 18, 1963, Kensington Elementary, in conjunction with several other schools, bused students to Delta Field at the Miami airport to meet the president. Herb was in the crowd that day, standing with his fellow students to greet Kennedy as he walked out on the gangway. 1 week later, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Sometime in Herb Jr.'s early childhood, Herb and Dot bought a baby goose that became the family pet. Herb Jr. named him Dewey from the cartoon. He played with Dewey and was quickly attached to this growing bird. Unaware to Herb Jr., Dewey was growing large and becoming a pest to the neighbors, getting into garbage and depositing presents in their yards. Herb and Dot had to decide what to do with Dewey. Minnie was an old widow that lived across the street. She suggested to Dot that they could eat Dewey. Dot soon brought the duck to Minnie to kill, dress, and cook. That night, well before Herb Jr. knew about the phrase, "Your goose is cooked," he unknowingly ate his own duck for dinner. For weeks, Herb Jr. looked around the neighborhood for Dewey and didn't learn about the dinner until he was much older. Lena Thompson Klein died December 7th, 1961. She was 77 years old. She lived in the same house for 35 years. She and Dorothy maintained their relationship for over 20 years. In her will, she left $500 to Dorothy. Dove Field was over there. No houses. Only houses were in this right area. So this 126th Street. Woods everywhere on this side. Some houses are new, nothing over here. So here we go. There's a basketball court there. This was my house. Right here, 10501. There it is. We have horses over there. This was my basketball court. There was a driveway over there. The ficus tree was right there. This was a driveway. Taking it out. Screened in. It's gotten a lot different. Lamanna's house. Wrights. Spence's. This was Duff's house right there. Looks the same. That one looks the same. It's kind of a weird house. Yeah. 124th Street. In September 1965, Hurricane Betsy struck southern Florida, mostly in the Keys. Herb and Dot had recently purchased a new, larger home in South Dade County. Shortly after the hurricane, the Williams prepared to move into the new home. They were confronted by damage from the hurricane. A large pine tree fell and landed on the roof and needed to be cut down. Herb enlisted family to help, and fortunately there was no structural damage. The new house was giant compared to the old one. A huge family room and dining room and separate living room allowed for more privacy. A large patio on the front side of the house was perfect for early morning visits. The new house also had 4 bedrooms, providing space from the old house's cramped bedroom that 4 children shared. The house was also in the woods, surrounded by acres of pine trees and palm fronds. The kids explored the woods and had hours of fun with no traffic and few neighbors. One of the factors of living in the woods was frequent forest fires. The boys would rush to the support of the firemen that were summoned. Amazingly, the firemen never ran the kids off, considering the dangerous circumstances. Different times and different thinking. Just 2 days before Herb Jr.'s 14th birthday, the family gathered around the television on Sunday afternoon. At 4:18 p.m., Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon.
Roger, Eagle, contact.
Roger, how does it look?
The Eagle has wings.
Roger.
The Eagle has wings. On its own now, but with Columbia near at hand.
11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down, 5.5 down. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. 6 forward.
60 seconds.
Lights on, forward, forward. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little.
30 seconds.
Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The historic event would be viewed live around the world. The U.S. had won the space race and fulfilled the timetable laid out in Kennedy's speech 6 years before. In the fall of 1968, Herb and Dot decided to enroll their children in private school. With the connections from Dot's mother and the previous owner of their new house, they decided on Miami Christian School. Miami Christian School was located about 12 miles from the house, and commuting would be scheduled between Dot and Herb. Miami Christian would turn out to be a great decision. Herb Jr. and Tom would graduate from their classes, both winning the McPhail Athlete Award for Best Athlete in 1973 and in 1975, respectively. Karen and John would graduate together at Westminster Christian School in 1978, where John would earn an All-City Award for football. Karen won a prestigious writing award for a short story. By 1977, Herb Jr. had married and left the family home, first moving to South Carolina and then back to Miami. Like his parents, their first child, Herb III, was born to young parents. So the cycle goes. In the coming years, John, then Karen, and finally Tom would marry and start their families, with the last wedding shortly after 1980. The families would grow exponentially during the 1980s. By August 1992, Herb Jr. had moved to Pembroke Pines in Broward County, 20 miles north of his previous home on Cutler Ridge Road. On August 22nd, he was having a housewarming party on Saturday night. During the party, one of his employees mentioned that a hurricane was coming, a surprise to everyone at the party. Hurricane Andrew arrived in the evening of August 24th, causing devastation to South Dade County. John had recently moved to Cutler Ridge and evacuated to the family home at Southwest 126th Street, much farther inland. Tom lived in a trailer in South Dade and would evacuate to his friend's house a few miles away. Karen lived near Coral Gables and stayed at her home. The storm had a huge impact on the Williams family. Each member would move and eventually relocate after the storm. Herb Jr. was unscathed and provided temporary living space for Herb and Dot, and then eventually Karen and her family. John would leave for South Carolina immediately. Karen would follow a year later. Tom would rebuild with the help of his church, but moved to Claremont, Florida. Herb and Dot would move to Babson Park, Florida. In 1957, after Herb graduated from Florida, Elmo, Herb's dad, purchased property in Central Florida on Crooked Lake and built a house. He designated the home for his grandchildren and wrote their names on the wall in the bedroom closet. This was a vacation home for the Williams and was a magical place for Dot and Herb and the kids. The family would spend summers on the lake, eventually boating and skiing. Each of the kids learned to swim there. By 2007, the family had moved to Greenville, South Carolina. Herb and Dot would live in an efficiency adjacent to John's house. By then, the grandchildren were having children, and Herb and Dot would enjoy the growing family. Dot would continue to write plays to be acted out on Thanksgiving gatherings. In December 2013, Herb Jr. would take Herb and Dot on a trip to Blowing Rock, North Carolina, where they encountered snow. They would visit Grandfather Mountain the next day and eat at Daniel Boone's restaurant in the neighboring town. Just 6 months later, Dorothy went to be with the Lord, dying quietly in her sleep. Herb was by her side. They were married for 59 years. She had 4 children, 15 grandchildren, and 19 great-grandchildren.
We are truly gathered together to celebrate the life of Dorothy Williams, my mom. A life truly rich and ripe with blessings. A life that has taken many turns and contained many faces. What would she want me to say? I might discuss her tremendous music talent, her ear for arrangement, her incredible timing and interpretation, growing up in a house full of music and never remembering a radio or phonograph. How she may have applied herself to play professionally, maybe at a philharmonic, but she actually contented herself with playing at Sunday school for kids and church functions. I might also reveal her talent for writing and producing plays. In the early days, she would design the stages with amazing props, and of course, I always played the main part. Years later, I realized it wasn't the talent that she saw, but just the availability, as she would intensively coach and drill me. Or how she trotted me out in front of 1,500 at Dade County Auditorium in a hot pink sequins jacket, singing, "Thank Heaven for Little Girls." Perhaps she could have developed her talent into performing arts and big productions, yet she chose to exercise her gifts at vacation Bible schools and later at family gatherings. You see, my mom lived in a time when being a mom was a full-time job, and they both sacrificed, especially at the beginning, with 4 kids in a single bedroom of a 2-bedroom house. I might develop her incredible people skills and relay how she took over an extremely unruly 6th grade elementary class as a substitute teacher in a ghetto school where 3 teachers had resigned in the first 2 months of the year. How she defied the principal and the administration to teach about the Lord, continuing the rest of the year, completely changing many lives with such results that the administration left her alone. How I visited her class on a field day and was absolutely amazed at the responses of the kids. She had Bible verses posted, and of course, her famous grab bag clearly visible. Or her sales skills, how she referred so many people for a food plan that she received an upright freezer, which the company was very reluctant to give her, never thinking anyone could pass the threshold. I might talk about her great evangelism gifts and how on Wednesday afternoon for many years, She gathered all the neighborhood kids for Bible stories and child evangelism. How she led many of my friends to the Lord. How she spent hours talking to friends that she just met, always turning the conversation towards the Lord. Or perhaps I might unfold her youthful, fearless spirit, and how she continually took us on trips and outings that defied logic. How she could make a visit to the dentist sound like an adventure. Like painting the roof, with us helping and getting more paint on us than the roof. Or what it was like to have every kid in the neighborhood wanting to play at my house because I had the greatest mom ever. And yet, if I could also speak of her incredible love for her husband, my father, for 60 plus years, they were bonded in such a way that is truly rare. And yet, if you asked her, she would not rate any of the above as the most important. Simply put, my mom's greatest accomplishment, her legacy, was her children and the gift of salvation that was perpetuated through her, down through her children, to their children, and then their children. You see, I was the firstborn, the first to receive her gift as she poured out Jesus in each and every instance during my early years. And the same is true for each of us. Tom, John, Karen. Not perfectly, but consistently. And then always praying for us as we got older. Early this year, my mom gave me my baby book for safekeeping. And as I began to read her comments, I was startled by the tenderness of her words. At the end of the book, in the margin, as kind of an afterthought, was a small entry that amazed me. She writes, February 1962, 6.5 years old. Your faith in the Lord is something I will never forget. You will never know how much you have strengthened mine. The day she went to be with the Lord, I told her about the comment and that she holds my memory. You see, I really don't remember ever not being a Christian. It was an incredible gift to have such an early faith. I am blessed to be given such a heritage. It's a heritage we all share. I know I often disappointed her, and she rarely showed it. As my brother John says, one of my mom's favorite books was the book of John. In chapter 18 in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said to the Father, of those you have given me, I lost not one. Mom was given 4, and she lost not one. A race run, a crown awaiting. On June 28th, sometime during the last hour of that day, without fanfare, she slipped quietly into the night in her sleep and transitioned from faith to face with her Savior. We are here now in what John MacArthur calls the kingdom of caterpillars, as we slowly transport the cocoon to its resting place, while a butterfly soars above.